We always hear that Israel is the United States' greatest ally, that they're such an asset for us in the Middle East. Could you explain the position? How do they rationalize and make that claim? Is there anything behind it? How do we say that Israel is somehow an asset to the United States?
Well, first of all, they are not an ally, meaning that we don't have any sort of mutual defense treaty with them. So that's a mistaken use of the term. They're not allies. Now, whether they're a friend, an asset, that's a practical question. And I think the answer to that clearly is no, that Israel has long been a liability. Israel, because of its behavior, even before, October 7th, has made many enemies and and in making enemies has only it created difficulties for the U.S., which is so clearly tied to Israel. Um, yeah, it's really hard to say what is. I know there are people that assume that somehow Israel is an asset. You find that on actually both the left and the right, both anti-Israel and pro-Israel people. There is a segment of the left that assumes that it really is the U.S. that's calling the shots, and that Israel is just an instrument of the U.S. But I think if you look closely at the politics, if you've been following the politics at all, you know, actually over the last decades, but particularly since October 7th, it's clear that Israel doesn't, it's not the U.S. that calls the shots. We've talked about this dozens of times. I mean, all the problems that Israel created for the U.S. over the years are now have been increased by an order of magnitude since October 7th. The U.S.'s reputation around the world has been severely damaged. Its relationships with other countries have, especially in the Middle East, have really suffered because of this war, right? And and so it's clear that the U.S. wants Israel to, for example, to achieve a ceasefire. Um, but Israel's not interested, and Israel knows that really it's in the driver's seat. It's the one calling the shots. It's not the U.S. You can just see it. If the U.S. really felt that it was in a commanding position, it would issue the orders. It would let Israel know, as we've said again and again, that you're not going to receive another bullet, another bomb, and you're going to have to end this attack and and work out a ceasefire with Hamas, and that's that. But they can't because again, the U.S. is not the one who is making the decisions here. So it's quite clear. They actually, on one level, the administration, like every administration before it, understands that Israel's a liability, creating problems, and now very, very serious problems for the U.S. Right? But they can't do anything about it. It's just they have to suffer Israel. It's you know, where is it benefiting the U.S.? I'm sorry, I can't see it. If you can, if anybody can explain to me, I'd like to hear about it.
Yeah, I think the argument that maybe some people make, a superficial argument, is this is the sort of the outpost that's fighting Islamic extremism. How would you argue against that?
Well, I would say it's actually the outpost that's creating Islamic extremism. I mean, if it's first of all, um, what are you saying? It's just like they're not defending anybody's borders, right? They're out there. They've seized land from Arab peoples, most both Muslims and Christians, and have created a lot of enemies in the process. And and through their really savage wars, they've created a lot of terrorists. I mean, it's really, if you look at the history of some of these terrorists, including some of those that were involved in the September 11th attacks, it goes back to attacks by Israel. People who had families or the families of friends completely wiped out by Israeli bombs. And this is something every time you wipe out a neighborhood or something, you create more terrorists. This is not an outpost that's protecting us from terrorists. Again, explain to me how that's happening. Like they're stopping them at the Mediterranean or something. It doesn't make a bit of sense. There's no border that they're defending. It doesn't. There's nothing that they're doing there to prevent terrorists from going into Europe or the U.S. But they certainly are creating terrorists. They're creating a lot of hatred. And you stop and you always, again, the natural tendency is to say, oh, they're just a bunch of religious fanatics or whatever. But stop and think about, well, if it was your family that was wiped out in that, how would you react? Are you so sure that you wouldn't dedicate your life to striking back at the country that did that, or the country you saw was made it possible, which was the U.S. that supports and arms, you know, the enemy of your family and all your friends?
Mhm. Right. Yeah, Israel is sort of a little a hate factory. It's just what it's doing is just creating hatred in the region.
Right.
Justifiably so, and it needs to end. I feel like though Israel this time is made a erred grievously, and it has really opened up a can of worms. I don't see any way that this ends without the destruction of the state of Israel itself in one way, shape, or form. Do you feel that as well? Is there any way out of this for Israel? Has it gone too
Well,
far? Do you
yeah.
think it could come
Well,
back?
theoretically, it could. I mean, it could end the conflict tomorrow, right? Theoretically. But you just don't see any signs of it, within the leadership. And again, as we've said many times, there isn't a faction within Israel that actually is pursuing an alternative strategy. Really, they're all on board, including the Labour Party, which is supposedly, the leftist party there. They're all on board with the IDF's actions. Sometimes the IDF, well, not just sometimes, but again and again, is held up as being like the sensible ones. But it's the IDF that, for example, struck the school the other day and killed 100 people, who were conducting their morning prayers. It's the IDF that's wiped out entire, blocks. Um, it's the IDF that's committing this genocide. Yeah, they're not the crazies in
Mm.
Israel, right? There's an attempt by people like Joseph Borrell, as you mentioned, and Democrats within the U.S., the Democratic senators and um, members of Congress, right, to say, well, the problem is Israel's got a problem, they admit, but it's just those ultra-nationalist crazies. It's the Smotriches and the Ben Gavirs, and they've got to be pushed out. And Netanyahu, I agree, we got to replace him with somebody like Gantz. But it, the difference there is really just a difference of rhetoric, of style. The fundamental policy is the same. They're both of them. They're all in favor. Let's say the overwhelming um, majority of the Israeli elite, and unfortunately of the Jewish Israeli public too, is in support of this genocidal war. So I just don't see.
So do you
Again,
see
you can say
this?
they could get out of it, but they just don't have the mindset. They've committed to this, and I think it's when you committed to something like this, it's very hard to step out. I mean, it's kind of you sell your soul to the devil. You start killing somebody. It's just, I think it's like we said before, and your hands are already bloody. It's hard to stop and say, okay, yeah, I just kind of committed half a genocide. Hey, sorry about that. Because when you do that, you've admitted to what you're doing, right? The incident. But
Mm.
so you start to see at one point the only solution is actually to carry it through to the end, and maybe we'll be victorious. I think that's what Netanyahu is doing. We'll have a larger war. Israel will be victorious. We'll realize the dream of a greater Israel, and then people accept us as the victors, right? And the victors always get to rewrite history, don't they?
So it sounds like you think that the die has been cast, that
Right.
we have set in motion some things that will eventually end. There's only two outcomes, either complete destruction of all these Arab countries, as well as the Persian, as well as Iran, or the destruction of Israel. It seems like that's where we're at right now. It doesn't seem like there's any other way, and the
Right.
only question is how many people will die in this process.
Yeah. Again, history is full of surprises. Sometimes there's some other path that you never see that opens up through some incident that we can't foresee. But looking at it now in, the broad terms, I would say yes, I'd agree with what you just said.
Well, it's such a crazy time of history that we're living through. I can't think of anything comparable. This is a very unique event in our
Yeah,
lifetime.
right. No, it certainly is.
Okay, right.